The door opened, and he walked in as though he owned the room. His black SS uniform was pressed without a single crease. His leather boots threw back the light like mirrors. The Iron Cross rested at his throat, a decoration he wore not as a memory of battle, but as a permanent announcement of his own importance. His capital was ash. His army was gone. His Führer was dead in a bunker beneath a burning city. None of it showed on his face. He walked with his chest forward and his chin up, moving through that American command post the way a king might walk through a conquered province, slowly, deliberately, expecting the room to rearrange itself around him. He stopped in front of the desk where the American commander sat. His boots came together with a sharp, ringing click. His right arm snapped upward in a stiff, precise salute. He stood at full attention, spine straight, eyes forward, and he waited. He waited for the return salute that protocol demanded. He waited for the handshake that tradition required. He waited for the small, formal acknowledgement that told him, "You are still a man of rank. You are still someone." The American officer did not look up. He kept his eyes on his paperwork. His pen kept moving. The seconds stretched. The silence in the room became a living thing, heavier than any spoken insult, sharper than any physical blow. Finally, the American set down his pen. He rose slowly from his chair. His eyes moved, not to the general's face, not to his eyes, but to the gleaming row of medals on his chest. He looked at them for one long, deliberate moment. Then he turned his back, walked to the window, and looked outside. The SS general's arm hung in the empty air. His face went red, then darker. The salute that no one returned. The room that refused to acknowledge him. For a man who had spent years commanding fear and receiving deference, the silence was not nothing. It was the punishment. And this was not a single soldier's private contempt. This was policy. This was an official, deliberate order, signed off at the highest level of American military command, that explicitly forbade U.S. soldiers from returning the salutes of SS officers. An order to withhold military courtesy, an order to look through them as if they were not there, an order to make the most arrogant men in Europe feel, for the first time in their lives, completely invisible. But to understand why General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a man known for his patience, his diplomacy, his respect for the rules of war, issued one of the most psychologically calculated directives in military history, you have to understand what he believed before he changed, and you have to understand the exact moment that belief died. For generations, European commanders had operated by an unwritten code. War was brutal, but the men who led it were gentlemen. When the battle ended, you saluted your enemy. You shook his hand. You shared a drink and discussed tactics across a table as peers. As recently as the North African campaign, Allied commanders had extended a grudging professional respect to German General Erwin Rommel, admiring his battlefield craft even as they worked to defeat him. By the spring of 1945, the surviving generals of the Nazi High Command expected nothing less. They expected to surrender with dignity. They expected Eisenhower to meet them as an equal across a table, pour them whiskey, and allow them to walk away with their pride intact. What they received was silence. And before that silence came, something had to break inside the man who ordered it. Eisenhower was not a man who ran on fury. Unlike General George S. Patton, who cursed freely, slapped soldiers, and wore his aggression on his face, Eisenhower was cool, methodical, and controlled. He believed in process, he believed in law, he believed, until he had reason not to, that even an enemy deserved to be treated as a human being. Then, on April 12, 1945, the U.S. Third Army opened the gates of a place called Ohrdruf, To understand the weight of that silence, you have to understand what came before it. You have to understand what generals on both sides of this war had believed, for most of their lives, about what kind of men they were. They believed they were gentlemen. The code between opposing officers stretched back centuries, through the Napoleonic Wars, through the American Civil War, through the frozen trenches of the First World War. A captured general was given his sidearms back as a gesture of respect. A defeated commander who surrendered with dignity was treated as an equal who had simply drawn the shorter hand. The war was the war. But the officers who ran it were supposed to remain, above the chaos, men of a certain standing. Nowhere did this tradition burn more brightly than in the deserts of North Africa, and nowhere was it more embodied than in the figure of General Erwin Rommel. Rommel was the enemy. And yet, Allied commanders talked about him with open admiration. Churchill stood before Parliament in 1942, in the middle of a string of humiliating British defeats, and called him a great general. American officers passed around copies of his pre-war tactical writings and studied them. They admired him the way athletes admire a great rival, not fondly, but with genuine acknowledgement that here was someone playing the same game at the highest level. This was the gentleman's war in full bloom, and it was exactly what the Nazi High Command was counting on in the spring of 1945. By then, there was no serious military mind in the Wehrmacht who believed Germany could still win. What they were thinking about, carefully, strategically, was what came next. In their minds, it looked something like this: a formal surrender, a table with the correct uniforms on both sides, and then the private moment afterward, the handshakes, the acknowledgement of a war well fought, the whiskey. Senior SS officers arrived at Allied checkpoints in staff cars loaded with fine luggage and bottles of French wine, fully expecting to be processed as men of rank, men whose status would survive their defeat. They were about to meet a man who had decided that baseline no longer applied. Dwight D. Eisenhower was not, by nature, a man of vengeance. In a military culture that produced Patton, volcanic, theatrical, impossible, Eisenhower was the counterweight. He mediated. He managed. He believed in order, in law, in the value of treating even difficult men as human beings worth engaging. It had taken decades to build that reputation, and it was genuine. But on April 12, 1945, something broke. What he was about to see with his own eyes, inside the gates of a place called Ohrdruf, was not a war that had been fought by gentlemen, and it would leave something cold and permanent in the place where the diplomat used to be. The reports had been coming in for days. Soldiers from Patton's Third Army, men who had waded ashore at Normandy, who had fought through the frozen hell of the Bulge, who had seen what artillery does to a human body at close range, were sending back dispatches that their commanding officers could barely process. The words didn't fit any category of battlefield experience. There was no tactical framework for what they were describing. On April 12, 1945, Eisenhower decided he needed to see it himself. He drove to Ohrdruf with Patton and General Omar Bradley, three of the most battle-experienced commanders in the American military, men who had collectively spent years making life-and-death decisions without flinching. They passed through the gates of the camp together. What met them was not a battlefield. It was something that existed outside the vocabulary of war entirely. The dead were everywhere, not fallen, not positioned the way soldiers fall, but discarded, piled, left where they had collapsed, skeletal frames barely distinguishable from the ground beneath them, as though the bodies had been reduced to the absolute minimum of what a human being could be before ceasing to exist altogether. The survivors still inside the wire were worse in a different way. They moved slowly or didn't move at all, with the hollow eyes of people whose minds had gone somewhere unreachable in order to survive what their bodies had endured. They were not quite present. They were, as one witness put it, living ghosts, men who still breathed but had already been to the other side of something. The smell reached them before anything else. It was total and inescapable, the smell of mass death, of bodies left in the open, of what happens when human beings are processed like material and the leftovers are simply abandoned. General George S. Patton, the man who slapped a soldier for showing fear, who wore pearl-handled revolvers and charged into every situation as though violence was a language he'd been born speaking, walked behind a building and vomited. Eisenhower did not look away. He moved through every section of the camp deliberately, forcing himself to see each execution shed, each instrument of torture, each pile of evidence that this was not incidental cruelty, but organized, industrial, systematic annihilation. He stood inside it and made himself understand what it was. Then he gave an order that revealed exactly what had shifted inside him. He commanded that every inch of the camp be filmed and documented, that local German civilians be marched through and made to witness it with their own eyes. And he said, with the quiet certainty of a man who had just seen something the world would one day try to deny, "Some bastard will get up and say this never happened." The diplomat was gone. What walked back out through those gates was colder, quieter, and already thinking about the men in the immaculate black uniforms who expected their whiskey. Most men, confronted with Ohrdruf, looked for a reason to leave. The generals who accompanied Eisenhower that day, Bradley, Patton, the senior staff who followed behind, moved through the camp the way people move through the scene of a terrible accident. Eyes forward, pace quickened, absorbing enough to confirm what they already feared before pulling back towards something manageable. The human mind has a self-protective instinct in the presence of extreme horror. It looks for the exit. Eisenhower didn't take it. He slowed down. He walked into the execution sheds one by one and stood inside them. He looked at the mechanisms. He examined the instruments of torture with the deliberate attention of a man who had decided, at some cost to himself, that looking away was a form of complicity. He crouched near the dead. He studied the faces, or what remained of faces, of the men who had been starved and worked and beaten to the edge of existence before being discarded like broken equipment. He did not rush. He did not shield his eyes. He forced the full weight of what he was seeing to land on him completely because he understood, with the strategic mind that had planned the liberation of an entire continent, that this moment required a witness who would not flinch. And then he started giving orders. Every camera available was to be brought to Ohrdruf and to every camp liberated afterward. Every execution room, every mass grave, every face of every survivor was to be photographed and filmed in exhaustive, unflinching detail. He ordered members of the American press to be brought in, journalists and photographers who could carry the evidence outward into newspapers and newsreels, into living rooms and government offices, into the permanent record of what the Third Reich had actually been. He ordered German civilians from the surrounding towns, people who had lived within miles of this place and claimed to know nothing, to be marched through the gates and made to look. Some wept, some fainted, some maintained, even then, the blank expression of people committed to a particular kind of not knowing. Eisenhower watched them too, and then he said it, quietly, without theatrics, in the flat tone of a man stating a fact he found intolerable but necessary. "Some bastard will get up and say this never happened." He was right, of course. He was already thinking decades ahead, past the surrender, past the trials, past the moment when the horror was still too fresh and too enormous to be denied. He was thinking about the long future, and he was building a wall against it with film and paper and the forced testimony of witnesses. But something else happened in those hours at Ohrdruf that no camera recorded. The part of Eisenhower that had extended professional courtesy to enemies, that had believed in the shared code of military men, that had seen the officer class as something worth respecting, that part didn't walk back out. The SS generals waiting for their whiskey were about to find out what replaced it. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler shot himself in a concrete bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin. The war in Europe had, for all practical purposes, already been over for weeks, but Hitler's death removed the last psychological anchor holding the Nazi command structure in place, and what followed was a collapse so total and so swift that it looked, from the outside, almost like evaporation. The 1,000-year Reich, the empire that was going to remake the world in its own image, had lasted 12 years and ended in a hole in the ground. And then the men who had run it started arriving at American checkpoints. They came in waves over the following days: generals, SS commanders, senior party officials, the administrative architects of the entire apparatus. Some arrived on foot, having walked through the chaos of a disintegrating country. But many, far more than the Americans had anticipated, arrived in a manner that said everything about the gap between what these men believed about themselves and the reality now surrounding them. They came in staff cars, Mercedes-Benz mostly, the engines still running cleanly, despite the fuel shortages that had grounded the Luftwaffe and stalled the panzer divisions for months. The trunks were packed with personal luggage, tailored uniforms still in their protective cloth covers, sets of fine china wrapped carefully for transport, bottles of wine and cognac taken from the cellars of occupied France and Belgium, and in several documented cases, artwork, paintings, sculptures, objects that had been someone else's until the Reich decided otherwise, now being carried into captivity as personal possessions by the men who had ordered them taken. The arrogance was not a performance. That was the remarkable thing. These were not men pretending to confidence they didn't feel. They genuinely had not fully processed what had happened. Years of a system that treated them as a biological and moral aristocracy, that built entire institutions around the premise of their superiority, had produced something almost impenetrable to outside reality. They had been saluted and deferred to and feared for so long that the muscle memory of dominance persisted even as everything around them collapsed. They looked at the young American infantrymen manning the checkpoints, boys from Ohio and Georgia and Minnesota, exhausted and mud-caked and entirely unimpressed. And some of them, with straight faces, expected those soldiers to stand at attention. They asked about their quarters. They inquired about meal arrangements. They made comments about the conditions of the holding areas that suggested they expected something closer to a hotel than a prison camp. One senior SS officer, by multiple accounts, expressed genuine indignation at being placed in a holding pen alongside enlisted men. He had rank, he had decorations, he had, somewhere in his luggage, a full dress. Uniform he had apparently planned to wear to his own surrender. He was placed in the mud with everyone else. The master race had arrived, and America had already decided exactly how to receive them. The message, when it arrived, carried with it a bitterness that cut deeper than any battlefield report. Word had reached Supreme Headquarters that certain SS commanders, men whose authority had been forged in brutality, were now demanding the courtesies of honorable soldiers. They wanted salutes. They expected handshakes. They sought recognition as if they belonged within the same code of conduct that governed the very armies they had spent years defying through atrocity. For General Eisenhower, this was the breaking point. He had walked through the camps. He had seen the evidence not as rumor or propaganda, but as undeniable reality. Piles of emaciated bodies, the hollow eyes of survivors, the machinery of death laid bare. There was no ambiguity left, no room for the abstractions of diplomacy or tradition. The request from the SS was not merely inappropriate, it was obscene. Military honor, as it had long been understood, rested on a shared belief in certain rules: respect for prisoners, dignity in defeat, a baseline of humanity even amid violence. But what Eisenhower now confronted was an enemy who had systematically rejected every one of those principles. To extend honor to such men would not uphold the code, it would corrupt it. And so he made a decision that was as symbolic as it was practical. All traditional rules of military honor, as they applied to the Nazi high command and SS leadership, were suspended. This was not a directive born of anger alone, though anger was certainly present. It was a calculated refusal to legitimize those who had forfeited any claim to professional respect. The order was clear. There would be no gestures that suggested equality between Allied officers and the architects of the camps. General Patton, never one to temper his feelings, did not hesitate in his support. He had seen enough, more than enough, to strip away any lingering notion that the enemy deserved the courtesies of soldiers. To him, the idea of saluting an SS officer was not just distasteful, it was intolerable. His agreement with Eisenhower was immediate and emphatic, grounded in a shared revulsion at what had been uncovered. The protocol that followed was precise in its instructions and unmistakable in its intent. No handshakes, no returning of salutes, no form of fraternization, formal or informal. Every interaction was to be conducted with cold efficiency, professional in execution, but stripped of all ceremonial respect. The usual rituals that softened the edges of surrender were deliberately withheld. In their place stood a stark message: the men responsible for such crimes would be treated not as peers, but as detainees, subject to justice rather than honor. It was, in many ways, a quiet order. There were no grand announcements, no public declarations meant to stir emotion. Yet within its restraint lay its power. It drew a clear and irreversible line between those who fought within the bounds of humanity and those who had abandoned them entirely. In the aftermath of unimaginable cruelty, Eisenhower's directive ensured that respect itself would not be misused as a shield for the undeserving. The order did more than alter protocol. It struck at something far deeper. For men who had built their identities on dominance, ritual, and unquestioned authority, the denial of recognition was not a minor slight. It was a wound. A salute, after all, was never just a gesture. It was affirmation, an acknowledgement of rank, of power, of existence within a structured hierarchy that placed them above others. To be denied that acknowledgement was to be diminished in a way no physical punishment could replicate. In many cases, it was the death blow to their carefully constructed sense of self. When Allied officers refused to return salutes, the effect was immediate and unmistakable. The expected exchange, the silent reinforcement of status, simply did not occur. Arms were raised, but nothing came back. What followed was not confrontation, but absence, a void where recognition should have been. And then came something even more devastating. They were looked through, not at, not with anger or even contempt, but through, as though they were no longer worthy of being seen. Conversations continued past them. Orders were given without acknowledgement of their former rank. Their presence, once commanding attention wherever they went, now failed to register at all. It was a total rejection, one that stripped away not just authority, but identity. For men accustomed to being treated like untouchable figures, feared, obeyed, and often revered, the psychological impact was profound. Confusion came first, a flicker of disbelief, as if the rules they had always relied upon had suddenly been rewritten without their consent. Then came the realization, settling in with increasing weight. This was not an oversight. It was intentional, deliberate, final. What followed was something closer to panic. Witnesses would later describe the look in their eyes, not rage, not even defiance, but something far more unsettling, a kind of blinding panic, as though the ground beneath them had given way. The rituals that had sustained their authority were gone, and in their place was a silence that offered no foothold, no reassurance, no path back to what they had been. They were no longer being resisted. They were being erased. This psychological unmaking was reinforced by the physical reality that quickly followed. The symbols of their former status, luxurious staff cars, attentive orderlies, private quarters, were removed without ceremony. In their place came the stark uniformity of captivity. Shovels replaced polished boots. Labor replaced command. Standard prison rations replaced the excesses they had once taken for granted. There was no negotiation, no gradual adjustment. The transition was immediate and absolute. Rank, which had once defined every interaction, now carried no weight at all. A general stood no taller than a guard, no more significant than any other detainee awaiting judgment. In this new reality, stripped of recognition and deprived of privilege, the illusion of superiority could not survive. What Eisenhower's directive accomplished was not merely the enforcement of discipline, it was the dismantling of a mindset. By removing the acknowledgement they craved, the Allies denied these men the very framework that had allowed them to justify their actions. And, in that absence, something fragile and hollow was revealed beneath the surface of power they had once wielded so effortlessly. By May 1945, the war in Europe had reached its inevitable conclusion. The machinery of the Third Reich, once so vast and terrifying in its reach, had collapsed into fragments. What remained was the formal act of surrender, a moment that, in another context, might have carried the weight of ceremony or reluctant respect between opposing commands. But this was not another context. The German delegation arrived in Reims under the shadow of total defeat, led by General Alfred Jodl and Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg. They came as representatives of a regime that had once demanded the submission of nations. Now they stood on foreign soil to offer their own. For Eisenhower, the moment was not one for spectacle. It was a matter of conclusion, nothing more, nothing less. From the outset, he made his position unmistakably clear. He would not sit at the same table as the German delegation. There would be no shared room, no staged photograph to immortalize the occasion as a meeting of equals. Whatever formalities remained would proceed without him lending even the appearance of parity. The message was deliberate. This was not a negotiation between peers. It was the acceptance of defeat. When the time came for direct contact, it was brief, almost startlingly so. The German representatives were brought into Eisenhower's presence, not as honored adversaries, but as emissaries of a collapsed authority. The atmosphere in the room was described as cold, stripped of any trace of diplomacy's usual courtesies. There were no gestures of welcome, no extended hand, no invitation to sit. They stood, and he remained exactly as he was, distant, controlled, immovable. If the German officers expected even the faintest acknowledgement of their former status, they found none. The silence in the room carried more weight than any spoken reprimand. It was the culmination of everything that had preceded it: the refusal of honor, the denial of recognition, the deliberate dismantling of the illusion that rank could shield them from the consequences of their actions. Eisenhower did not waste words. He asked only what was necessary. Would they accept the terms of surrender, yes or no? There was no room for explanation, no space for negotiation, no allowance for delay. The question was not framed as an invitation, but as a demand for clarity. It reduced the moment to its simplest and most unavoidable truth. The war was over, and the outcome was not theirs to shape. The answer, when it came, carried the weight of finality. Yes. With that single word, the authority they had once wielded dissolved completely. There were no further exchanges, no closing remarks to soften the reality of what had just occurred. Eisenhower dismissed them as abruptly as he had received them. The meeting lasted only minutes. Yet within that brevity lay something profound. There was no triumphalism, no outward display of victory. Instead, there was restraint, an unyielding insistence that justice, not ceremony, would define the end of the conflict. At Reims, the war in Europe did not conclude with handshakes or mutual respect. It ended in silence, in distance, and in the cold certainty that some actions place those responsible beyond the reach of honor forever. In the end, what was denied proved just as powerful as anything that had been taken by force. To extend honor to the SS, to treat them as soldiers bound by the same codes as those who had fought against them, would have done more than preserve tradition. It would have affirmed the very illusion upon which they had built their identity. Recognition, even in defeat, would have offered them a final refuge, the belief that they had belonged to a system of order, of legitimacy, of warped but coherent purpose. Eisenhower understood the danger in that. Validation, however small, would have allowed them to retreat into the mythology they had created around themselves, a mythology of superiority, of destiny, of being something beyond ordinary men. To salute them, to shake their hands, to acknowledge their rank in any meaningful way, would have suggested that they had been participants in a shared profession rather than perpetrators of something far darker, and so that validation was refused, completely and without exception. In its place stood something far more confronting, a mirror. Stripped of ceremony, denied recognition, and removed from the structures that had once elevated them, the SS commanders were left to face a reality they could no longer distort. Without the uniforms of authority, both literal and symbolic, the image they had cultivated began to fracture. They were not supermen. They were not untouchable architects of a new order. They were, in the stark clarity of defeat, what their actions had always revealed them to be: diminished, exposed, and accountable. The silence imposed upon them became a form of truth-telling. There were no speeches required, no elaborate condemnations necessary. The absence of acknowledgement said everything that needed to be said. It denied them the dignity they had never extended to others. It refused them the narrative they might have used to justify themselves in the years to come. In that silence, there was no escape. It was perhaps the most precise form of justice available in that moment, not the justice of courts or sentences, which would come later, but the immediate and unmistakable stripping away of illusion. A quiet dismantling, carried out not with force, but with absence. And yet this silence was never about erasing history. On the contrary, it was about preserving it, clearly, honestly, and without distortion. To refuse honor to those who had committed such crimes was not to diminish the traditions of military respect, but to protect them. It ensured that those traditions remained tied to principles of humanity rather than becoming tools that could be manipulated by those who rejected those very principles. At the same time, it reaffirmed something equally important: the memory of those who had suffered and those who had fought. The fallen were not honored through ceremony shared with their oppressors, but through the unwavering refusal to equate the two. Veterans who had endured the brutality of the war were not diminished by this denial of courtesy. They were, in many ways, upheld by it. Their service remained distinct, grounded in a cause that did not require illusion to sustain it. History, in this sense, was not allowed to blur. It was held in place by the choices made in those final days, the decisions to draw lines, to deny false equivalence, and to let silence speak where words might have softened the truth. What remained was not spectacle, but clarity, a clarity that ensured the past would not be rewritten, and that the weight of what had occurred would endure, unshielded by misplaced respect or convenient forgetting.